Today we're going to look at the integumentary system. And the integumentary system is more than just epithelial tissue. It does include your skin, but it's made up mostly of connective tissue that's underlying that dry cutaneous membrane. There's also hair and nails and many different types of glands, including sweat and sebaceous glands. So we'll take a look at all of this in order to talk more about the integumentary system. When we're talking about the integumentary system, we're talking about something that consists of epithelial tissue and connective tissue. The skin, or the integument, is the largest organ system in the body. It manages to cover a surface area of 1.2 to 2.2 square meters, which weighs 4 to 5 kilograms. That's about 7% of your total body weight. It does vary in thickness. There is a thin and thick version of the skin, or at least the top layer, the epidermis of the skin, that you can see depending on what part of the body you're looking at. The epidermis also replaces itself completely every 25 to 45 days, the epidermis being that top layer of skin made up of epithelial tissue. So the integument begins at the top with the outermost superficial region known as the epidermis. You also have a middle dermis made up of mostly connective tissue, but also an area that contains a lot of the stuff for the integument. The integument itself is many different layers, including a lower layer called the hypodermis, also known as the superficial fascia. This is a really deep region that consists mostly of areolar connective tissue and adipose tissue. The adipose tissue is just fat tissue that helps kind of support the other two layers of the integument. But let's look at the epidermis first. It is made up of keratinized stratified squamous epithelium and has 4 distinct cell types. There are 4 or 5 layers, depending on if you're looking at thick skin that has 5 layers or thin skin that has 4, and its main function is protection. So it has these many layers of kind of flat scale-like cells, but also a layer of keratin on top, which is a protective fibrous protein. Let's take a look at those layers. Let's start at the top. We have stratum corneum and then stratum lucidum. These 2 layers are just dead keratinocytes, the main cell type you find in the epidermis. Stratum corneum is the most superficial layer, and stratum lucidum is a layer of skin that is only found in thick skin. In thin skin, stratum lucidum would be missing. Below stratum lucidum, you have stratum granulosum. These cells are still living, and they're creating granules like lamellar or keratohyalin granules. Lamellar granules provide some waterproofing, and we see that in stratum lucidum. And then the keratohyalin granules are kind of the precursors to creating keratin protein fibers. As we move down into stratum spinosum, which is one of the thickest layers besides stratum corneum of cells, we start to see other cells besides keratinocytes, including the dendritic or Langerhans cell. These are immune cells that act as key activators for the immune system. We move further down, we're starting to see cells like the melanocyte, which creates the pigment melanin, the Merkel disc, also known as the tactile cell, which is a touch receptor. And in that lowest level, we're in stratum basale, and that layer is sometimes called stratum germinativum because it is still mitotically active and it's producing more epithelial cells. Now, the further we get away from stratum basale, we're also getting further from the dermis, and the dermis contains blood vessels, which is where all the epithelial cells of the epidermis get their nutrition. So as you move further and further away from stratum basale and that adjacent dermis, the cells do start to die because they can no longer get nutrition via diffusion, which works best over a shorter distance. But that's okay because stratum basale again is creating cells ongoingly, and so those cells that are created from stratum basale will start to move up away from that layer up to the surface of the skin. So we're constantly replacing the layers of the epidermis. Let's take a closer look though at those cell types. You have first the keratinocytes. They produce the fibrous protein keratin, and they're the most abundant cell type in the epidermis. They are tightly connected by desmosomes, so there's some stretch and give between the cells that make up the epithelial sheet of the epidermis. The very top layer of stratum corneum cells do slough off every day, and so they're slowly sloughing off because they have died and they're essentially too far from the blood vessels, which is why they have died. There's also melanocytes and dendritic or Langerhans cells, which you find more in the deeper epidermis. And we're going to see that melanocytes and dendritic cells are both kind of star-shaped, or you could consider them spider-shaped cells, but they have essentially extensions of their cell membrane that go out in between the keratinocytes. Melanocytes are located not only in the deepest epidermis, but they produce a pigment known as melanin. Dendritic or Langerhans cells are also going to patrol the deep epidermis, and they're key activators of the immune system because they destroy pathogens as they encounter them, but take pieces of those pathogens which cause disease and take them to immune organs like lymph nodes to let the whole body know that they've encountered something dangerous. And there's many different types of tactile or Merkel cells, or we could just generalize them and call them touch receptors in the epidermis. You find even more in the dermis, but one we're going to look at is the Merkel cell, which functions as a touch receptor in association with connected sensory nerve endings. So we've kind of looked at all of the different layers as really just an overview to get an idea of what we're talking about when we talk about the epidermis. If you're having a hard time remembering the stratum layers or the layers of the epidermis, you can remember the name, or really the phrase, "Come, let's get sunburn." And that is not at all me trying to entice you to get sunburn. That's actually a superficial or first degree burn. So we don't want to do that. But it is a way to remember the layers of thick skin. So for "come, let's get sunburned," first letter in each one of those words stands for a strata. So corneum, lucidum, granulosum, spinosum, and basal. Let's take a closer look at all of these layers though. We have the deepest epidermal layer that's firmly attached to the dermis, that's stratum basal. Pretty thin layer is just a single row of keratinocytes. These are considered stem cells. They're mitotic, they're still dividing, and they produce 2 daughter cells per mitotic division. So this is creating more epidermal cells, and they move away from stratum basal as they're created. And as they get closer to the surface, the cell dies because it's too far from the nutrition that is provided from the blood vessels in the dermis. Now, the cells undergo mitosis really only in this basal layer. You might still see them finishing up mitosis as they move upward into stratum spinosum, but it's only stratum basal that is known as stratum germinativum because cells primarily undergo mitosis in this layer. Then you also have the prickly layer, or stratum spinosum, and this is because the keratinocytes appear spiny. They're also sometimes called prickle cells. That's because they're starting kind of shrivel. Their cell membrane is kind of shrinking around the structures in their cytoplasm, and that is making them appear spiny. It's making a lot of the filaments that are in the cell stick out of that cell membrane. Now, melanin granules and Langerhans cells are also abundant in this layer. In the deepest part of this layer, in stratum spinosum, you also find melanocytes, not just their granules from their projections. But we can't forget stratum granulosum. This is actually, as we move away from stratum basal, the last living layer of cells. It's still pretty thin, maybe 3 to 5 cell layers, and we start to see a drastic change in the keratin cells, or keratinocytes. They begin to flatten, their nuclei and organelles begin to accumulate. That's because they're very far from their nutrition and they're starting to die. Cells above this layer do die. But what the granulosum cells can do is they start to form a lot of granules, hence the name granulosum. 2 types of granules accumulate in this layer: the keratohyalin, which help form keratin fibers in the upper layers, and lamellated granules, which give rise to a waterproofing glycolipid that is very prominent in the next layer up, or the next superficial layer. In thick skin, that next superficial layer is stratum lucidum, or a clear layer. Again, it's only present in thick skin. In thin skin, this layer is absent. It's a very thin layer, and it's just a band of superficial cells that is above stratum granulosum. They're all dead keratinocytes, and they provide some waterproofing to the skin where we have this layer. But the corneum or stratum corneum, the most outermost or superficial layer of the epidermis, is definitely the thickest. It's 20 to 30 cell layers thick. Even though it's completely made up of dead cells, it still functions in protection and provides waterproofing. It prevents abrasion and penetration to a certain degree. It also renders the body relatively insensitive to biological, chemical, and physical assaults as long as it's not lacerated or broken. So, this is a very protective layer, and these cells are mostly keratin at this point. The cells are dead, so they're kind of just leftover granules, whether it be keratin or the lamellated. So, they're going to provide not only waterproofing, but dense protection from the structural fiber that is keratin. So, now we've taken a look at all the layers of the skin. We can see thick skin is the one that we've been talking about. Thin skin would miss stratum lucidum, but it looks very similar in both the kind of clip art depiction on the left and the actual micrograph on the right. Keep in mind that stratum basale is most adjacent to the dermis. Stratum corneum is the most superficial layer. Other cells you find more in the deeper epidermis, like the Merkel cells, melanocytes, and the dendritic or Langerhans cells. There are other ways to view the epidermis. The picture we saw before kind of depicted the different layers with different colors, even if slightly. But the layers of the epidermis are essentially one tissue. They are all stratified squamous epithelial cells. So they're all a part of one tissue, but they do have slightly different structure and function. All right, now that we've taken a look at the epidermis, we're going to go ahead and move on and look at the middle region, or the dermis in the